Hello everyone, this is Mr. Nobody bringing you part 2 of the Burdens of Consciousness. Now, just to reiterate what that was about, I talked about how we all have this special burden as a result of just being conscious beings, of not just being, deer or something much simpler, that we understand the past, we understand the future, we know what kind of creatures we are. That's a special sort of burden. And that there's a couple different ways that we manage that immense burden when faced with the world. We actually see how big the world is. We see how big the problems are that are confronting us. And it's such a massive scope of vision that it creates unique problems for us as humans that are very difficult to address because we're not really... although we're brilliant, although we have these brilliant brains that are the most complex objects in the universe, we're still not that much above a deer, in terms of scope, longevity, strength, quickness. There's still not that much more of us, really. We're still very limited sorts of creatures. And I mentioned that one of the ways that we solve that problem is through outsourcing bits of it to other people, through dividing up and sharing the burden amongst a group, as a social enterprise. And that's how we address the universe and the problems in it. And we do that to a massive degree. We do it to a degree that we're not even aware of. Like, we don't see the infinite amount of people that are actually involved in any tiny thing that we have. We have this little problem of, I need a pencil, and this is an example that some of you who study economics may have heard of before. It's like, well, me needing a pencil is a pretty simple problem. Maybe I need to ask my wife where to get one, but overall, it's not a super complex problem. But the problem is, where do pencils actually come from? And you learn, actually, the lead or graphite in it comes from one continent, the wood in it comes from another continent, the rubber in the eraser comes from another continent, it's all assembled in another place, it's all distributed in another place. Like, it takes the entire world just to give you something like a pencil. And so many things aren't just geographically distributed, they're also temporally distributed, by which I mean we rely on someone else having figured that out at another time. So the people of the past, we're leaning on the people of the past as well as the people of the present. They were immediately surrounded by human civilization is this enormous cooperative project, which is spectacular, but it means we can overestimate our own significance sometimes. It also means we're relying on others much more than we really think we are. Anyway, that's one of the ways we solve the problems, by needing each other, by helping each other. And another way that I mentioned that we handle this burden is through adjusting our focus, through either narrow but deep or wide but shallow. That we either look at a bunch of different varieties of things, but each of them more shallowly, or we specialize and we get really deep into something very specific. And that we just sort of automatically do that it's a feature of our brains. And it seems to be just built in, and it seems to be necessary in many ways. And it's how our eyes work. Even at this moment, looking at me, if you are looking at me instead of listening to me, you're doing the very thing that I'm talking about, because your own vision is divided up this way. You have this central part of your vision which has an incredible amount of detail, and you're always keeping it on the move and always tracking things, and it sees things in great detail. But it's actually only this tiny little portion right in the middle of your vision. The majority of your vision is all this peripheral vision. Your peripheral vision does not see things in great detail or great focus. It takes a very wide look at the world, but very general, enough to kind of help you move around in it, but very general. In fact, it's so general that you can hide things in it. You can, if you've seen the experiments like that gorilla experiment where because someone's focus is on one thing, like passing a ball between people, you can have a person in a gorilla costume walk right through the middle of it and nobody sees them, which just shows how low resolution your detail actually is in your peripheral vision. And you can also hide entirely missing chunks of information, where you have your optic nerve. That's just a missing area of information, but your brain just looks at the surrounding stuff and fills it in. It's there. There's just a hole in your vision on both sides, but your brain does a lot of work and it just edits it out, which isn't that hard because, as I said, your peripheral vision, although it's extremely wide and extremely useful, is not highly detailed. And then you have your narrow focal vision. That's just how it works. It's how your brain is rigged to work. It's how your perception is rigged to work. And it's very useful. So as I said, those are a couple of things that we do naturally to help us manage these problems. And then I did talk about how technology in many ways is mismatching and distorting this. It's taking the natural environment that our information gathering used to take place in. It used to take the natural mechanisms we used for gathering information, and it's turbocharged them, but in ways that actually create serious problems and create major mismatches, both in our ability to evaluate and emotionally and intellectually react to those perceptions, as well as our ability to act on and have agency. They, in a sense, they distort our world. And they also filter our world, powerfully filter our world in predetermined ways that we're not necessarily really designed to see through. So I do want to just jump back into the discussion. I also want to just kind of get you back into the flow of what I was talking about. So as I was saying, it's not entirely clear we're meant to get our idea of the people around us from this enveloping shroud of distantly collected electronic information instead of from real life encounters with real people, real places and situations that directly intersect with our lives. And so our emotional reactions are keyed to things that our mind and our emotions anticipate being close to us, being in our immediate environment, and that they make up a general representative picture of our entirety of our environment. Because, if you were encountering crazy people 50 times a day in your immediate just daily life, clearly you're in a crazy place and you should be freaked out and you should be responding to it. Now, the problem is, if you're just hanging around your house or just doing your work or just going to the grocery store or something, you may not actually have that experience. But thanks to the miracle of the internet, you can be fed insanity and scary things and craziness constantly, every single second, perfectly pulled to you from every place it can be found, because your emotional systems are keyed to devour it and respond to it, to want to see it, to check in on it. And so we've made these algorithms whose job is to serve those instincts. So, it's good to know about, as I said, and touch the wider world, but we've actually subverted the natural structure of how we encounter and how we define and how we experience the world through our technology. We live in a personally constructed mental world. We live in a world of our own creation and curation. It's more like a product of our own underlying emotional instincts catered to by businesses, and especially these technological automatons. All this content is carefully selected by the algorithms. The algorithms don't ask, is this really representative of their environment? Is this good for them even? That's not their job. Their job is just to match our desires and our impulses and reinforce our ideas, reinforce our prejudices, our preferences, our identity, our concern. Bring us more and more and more of that, whatever that thing is that provoked your response. And the natural world can only do that to a certain degree, and usually it can only do that when it's become a pretty crazy place. Anyway, now, in a time before the specialization of media, we actually had to kind of share our sources of information. We had to share it with a lot of different people people who had different interests, different opinions, who inhabited different worlds from us. There were fewer options, so they had to be much more generalized. We had to share a small number of TV channels and a small number of newspapers, and we largely had to live inside the world as we daily encountered it in our own lives and in our own communities. Like that was the primary environment that you inhabited, was something like your neighborhood or your work or your family at home. We saw the problems in those areas, we saw the needs, and we took action within our own close personal family and neighborhoods and town, within our own personal lives. Being forced to share those resources basically forced us to be less partisan and more interconnected. We had to strive more through them to be neutral and unbiased, because these spaces had to be shared. And if we didn't do that, you'd lose half the audience. So a lot of the focus of things like media was more on detailed reporting of local events and issues, and a much smaller focus, rather than the really long, far away, detailed views of national affairs, which you just got as kind of the icing on top of the cake. If you ever go to a small town and read the paper, a huge amount of it will be things like what the local kids are doing, some person who got married, stuff to do with the county commissioners, like the business of life, more of that specific town. Now, you will have things like national level stuff that has some impact, and some state level stuff, but it's usually just the stuff that might actually have a direct impact on you. It's more like mostly local, then the sort of regional, and then at that more national level, like this. And in many ways, that's much more attuned to people's actual experience. Now, I will say that I don't know if I'd use the word a victim. I would say I'm certainly guilty of misusing this technology as much as anyone. I would find it much easier to sit down or walk around and listen to like an hour-long talk about the problems at some schools in California, because it's stimulating, than I would be willing to listen to an hour-long meeting about my own daughter's school in my neighborhood or my own school district. And it's funny that, isn't it? I mean, think about it. What would you rather hear about the things happening in your neighborhood, or have to listen to your kids or your spouse talk about themselves? Or would you rather, listen to what they're learning and what they're worried about in your own local school district? Or is it much easier and more stimulating, more tasty and exciting, and also more convenient, as I said, to flip on the internet or the news, YouTube, some website and say, ooh, what crazy thing is happening in Canada right now? What crazy thing are they doing in schools in New York? And like, what do I have to do with schools in Canada or New York or California? Absolutely nothing. How many times do they directly intersect with my life day to day? Virtually none. Whereas my kids are at their own school all day, all week long, every day. How much can I do about what's happening in schools in New York? Absolutely nothing, And so what you have here is this presentation of a kind of false environment with a false call to action that you can't really respond to, and you don't know how to respond to it. It sort of sits around in you and starts just making you kind of crazy. And I think that's one way in which technology has altered the way we're actually handling the burden of consciousness by dislocating it from its purposes and confusing it. Now, like I said, we used to have these shared institutions, but we don't need shared institutions anymore. We can feel, incorrectly, in my opinion, that we're actually living in a very different world from the place that we physically live in, that we're citizens of some more rarefied community, some mental community that represents us and validates us and supports us and understands us more than the pedestrian rabble that actually surround us in a more banal sense, more than the actual neighborhood that I live in, more than maybe even the people in my own family. But certainly more than my actual proximate community, the people who are genuinely part of the world that I live in. We see ourselves as living in the world of a specialized cultural narrative. So we have the long view, narrow angle view of our community as liberalism or conservatism or some other ism. And like I say, it's a fairly narrow circle with a lot of details in it, and we see that as being, that's where I exist, in this little circle. And it's got great depth, so we think it's big, but a lot of it's actually very distant from where we are. And maybe you have a different view. Maybe you have some idea of yourself as existing on an international stage as a citizen of the world. Whether or not you actually meaningfully know or spend any real time with people in other countries. Maybe all you do is glance at the BBC now and then and somehow think, ooh, that's the world I exist in. We have ideas of the community that we exist in that don't actually overlap, sometimes hardly at all, with the actual physical community that we live in. Or maybe it does if you've siloed yourself effectively enough. But my point is, your brain was designed for physical proximity, your reactions, so many of those systems. That's what it was made for. So, like I say, I think this is just part of the structural problem. It's driving some of the unfortunate results and craziness that we've been seeing lately. This is a kind of alienation. It's alienation from the intimacy and complexity and immediacy of a real human community. I don't think it's good for us to be able to slough off other people or treat them like garbage, to be able to do that online and not suffer any real consequences. But that's fully possible. Whereas in real life, could you behave in real life the way that you act online? What kind of person is it making of you by giving you this sort of false environment? I often have to tell my girls, you can't say things like that to people in real life and still expect to be friends with them or be able to work with them. Like, there are things you can't say and things you can't do in real life. There are ways you can't act if you actually want to work with and be around these people. In real life, we need politeness, we need standards, and we need there to be consequences for certain kinds of antisocial behavior. And that's part of what maintains our sanity and us being a certain kind of person. We actually need to be lodged in communities that support correction to our own excesses. It's good for us to have to be polite to people who are different from us so we can continue working side by side with them. That is a good discipline for people. It's good for us to see the look on someone's face when we treat them well. And it's good for us to see the look on their faces when we don't. We learn something from that interaction, even from that nonverbal interaction. It is good to know about the fears and the dangers that are really close to you and about the things that need to be done that you actually have a connection to and can do something with. And actually, there is a burden and a duty for you to deal with them. And this is also part of the problem, as I said, we're finite. We only have so much emotional bandwidth. We only have so much mental and physical energy. And so it's good if we can avoid wasting too much of it on distorted perceptions of danger and action that needs to be taken on things that are far off, that are beyond our ability to meaningfully understand or judge or solve, things that actually are far outside our actual lives. Now, having said that, I do want to make it clear, I'm not saying that long view things aren't important. The problem is the distortion. The problem is the approach. So you remember the lens of our mind operates best along this curve of small group, you know, near wide, shallow near wide, and long, narrow, detailed. The further that you want to see clearly, the more you have to narrow your view. And we do need people who can do that in a big, complex, interconnected world. But when that's the main way that we start to perceive and experience and react to things, to our proximate, immediate, close-up world, that's going to start messing with our perspectives. You're wearing glasses, you're trying to look at things with the wrong lens, is what I'm saying. You're trying to walk through a minefield of close things with a telephoto lens. Or you're trying to navigate through, a vast landscape with a macro lens. Neither one of those is just going to work very well. But we're messing ourselves up that way with our technology. People have talked a lot about the science of fear, the science of emotional response, mob responses, things like that. And it's been shown fairly well that people's instincts and understanding of statistics and threats and data are often very unreliable when they're applied to large-scale issues. The Science of Fear, that's a very interesting book that I read a while back, a number of years ago on that subject. It concerns itself quite a bit with the way that our mixture of access to long view isolated effects, divorced from actual expertise and tangible experience, combined with the emotional reactions that are tuned for close-in experience, because our brain interprets information about threats as if they were proximate to us, as if they were in our immediate environment, even if they're not, even if they're super far away. And that results in us drawing lots and lots of wrong conclusions, especially about how worried we should be about things. That's just the tip of the iceberg. I've singled out threats as one area of concern just because threats make easy examples. People respond really easily to outrage and fear, far more easily than to almost anything else, which has also been demonstrated. Outrage is the most fundamentally viral thing on the internet. It spreads like a virulent disease. But I don't think that's the only way that our world is being distorted by this, just in the manner of fear. I think the distortion that's going on is happening to us on many levels, in many different ways. It's affecting all of our reactions, our positive reactions, our negative reactions, how we value things, how we prioritize things, how we react to different kinds of information. It's messing with our entire headspace. Now, of course, I understand the appeal of the internet 100%. Why would I be here talking if I didn't? There is a lovely seduction to slipping the bounds of the lenses of human perception. It makes us feel like a god in our world, like we can see everything, like we have this fantastic insight into the truth. Plus, we just have these emotional systems that easily addict it to us. But it gives us this lovely kind of distance and superiority in our own immediate life. It lets us reduce the whole wide world of immediate experience to just a narrow peephole of the particular perspective that we're looking through. And the internet helps us do that. It lets us expand our shallow view of our immediate myopic experience and blow it up to cover all the farthest reaches of existence. By turning that into our whole world. It lets us see the whole vastness of the wide world so shallowly and myopically that we can't make out anything that doesn't fit our immediate perspective. So we see all of existence, but we see it in this super shallow look where all I see is the things, my own little myopic interests, just because it's all fed, it's all filled in for us. So in both these cases, whichever direction you go in making mistakes of distorting your perspective, you end up seeing a world that fits very neatly into your own limited personal perspective and demands very little from us except what your instincts naturally want to see. And it's a very self-affirming way to view the world. It makes the bounds of the world the same as those of our own temperamental viewpoint. So that creates very much a self-reinforcing cycle, because the internet can detect very easily how you want to see the world, and then it can say, fine, I can make that the whole world. I can find everything that needs to be found. I can tailor things. I can either shut you in or I can blow you up, whatever needs to be done, but I can make your instinctive temperamental viewpoint the defining principle of your entire experiential world. And it doesn't have to be interrupted by anything else that would mess with it. So one interesting example of this that, of course, we all just lived through, where you see those differences in the lenses of human perspective and the vast world of information and the variation in how that's approached, was coronavirus. Every single day, we were all being absolutely bombarded with information about it. Statistics about infections and deaths were being reported every day like football scores. And it was freaking people to freak out. It was incredibly stressful to people. People's entire immediate experiences came to consist of just this repeated drumbeat of huge world-spanning statistics and warnings of vast existential danger that they themselves have little efficacy, little experience of and little efficacy toward. For some people, the virus itself, like actually having it, was part of their immediate experience, and they were dealing with it in their immediate experience as an actual problem that they or someone they knew had. I did eventually get the coronavirus, and it was very different from the experience of the whole pandemic. Of course, I'm a young guy, but I got it, and I was like, oh, I'm a little bit sick. Something's going on. And then I was like, oh, no, I found out I actually have the coronavirus. And well, it meant I had to hang around home a bit. I was unusually tired, but it was basically like having a mild cold. I didn't even get many symptoms except just feeling really tired for like a week. But that experience of my personal immediate dealing with it, and my wife too, was completely different from our experience of coronavirus, the mental phenomenon, which we went through for like 2.5 years. And dealing with it and responding to it, seeing what the dangers were, all that stuff, it was a completely different thing, so that was like a highly personal experience. And then there's my, I happen to be related to an infectious disease doctor, and with experts like that, there are people whose specialized job is to deal with these large-scale issues like this and have a narrow, specialized focus on something like this. But most ordinary people, they were just stuck in, some in-between stage. They weren't medical experts where that's their whole focus. And a lot of them didn't actually have coronavirus, so they were in between. But they were surrounded by vast oceans of information, warnings about things that we didn't really know that much about, that we didn't really know what to do about or what our actions were actually achieving. In fact, our day-to-day experiences often contradicted the narratives that we were very concerned about, So, understandably, a lot of people would just start overwriting their interpretation of their experience with the terms of the narrative. So those fear and anxiety reactions that are meant to spur us toward action, to respond to, and to avoid or to remove threats, that they kept building and building in us, and we didn't know what to do with it because we weren't actually experiencing the immediate thing itself. And that caused a lot of craziness among people. It caused, caused a lot of unproductive emotional reactions, or even counterproductive emotional reactions. It made us turn on each other a lot. It made us do a lot of crazy stuff. Partly just because we had this fear that was constantly being reinforced as an idea of this vast, nebulous enemy. And as a result, you feel that becomes the world you live in. You feel a need to confront it. But it's not in front of you, so how do you confront it? What do you do? Well, you find some way, you find some proxy, you find something to respond to, you find something to attack, you find something to try to drive out or to control. You know, that's what people do. We find someone or something to stand in for that function. It's just a fact of human psychology that if you keep telling people, be afraid, be afraid, be afraid, something's out to get you, something's out to get you, eventually people will believe that, especially if they hear it a lot and from many places, you know. But if we can't easily find the thing that we're supposed to be afraid of, we'll just find something to be afraid of, you know, because we have to. Fear is a very functionally actionable emotion. You know, it's not just emotion that you sit in. It's an emotion that's trying to tell you, do something, fight or flight, hide or crush, hide or crush. You know, that's what fear does. Fear isn't just something you say, oh, okay, so terror is what I should be feeling. Okay, I know what to do with that, and it's to keep calm. You know, so it's a very actionable feeling, but if the action to resolve that fear isn't very clear or isn't apparent, we'll just find whatever outlets we can. We'll find whatever substitutes we can. There's this funny psychological phenomenon called concept creep, which you may have heard of. Basically, it means that if you tell someone that they need to find something, and you make it hard for them to find, they'll just loosen and adjust their definition of the thing that they're supposed to be looking for until they can find it. So if you tell people to find purple dots on a page of dots, but then over time you gradually reduce the actual number of purple dots, people will just start loosening their idea of what qualifies as purple. They won't find fewer dots. They'll change their definition of purple as long as it helps them find the thing they have been told they need to find. They've been given this motivation, and perception is very affected by motivation, and fear is a powerful motivator. So concept creep really becomes a problem, especially when you're dealing with proximity and perspective and information processing. These things, these problems with consciousness and understanding, they're deeply entangled with the issues that we've been talking about here. And psychologists have noticed that there has been a large amount of concept creep in our social language lately. You know, terms that used to be very specific and restricted, especially terms describing threats and danger and injury, have gradually crept way beyond their former boundaries. You know, because statistically, the world is way safer than it has ever been. But our perception of the world, our sort of narrative about it, is very much the opposite if you listen to anyone. You know, and the reason is we've got all of these threat-seeking systems in us. That is what we have as humans. We have all these threat-seeking systems. But we actually don't have as many clear, proximate, like immediate to our lives, external threats to direct them at. But that's not going to stop us from finding threats that we need to be afraid of or that we feel we need to confront. We will just find them within whatever our set of actual experiences are. We'll find them in whatever world we have. We'll even build a world to help us find it. Which isn't to say that there aren't real threats in the world, near and far. There are threats everywhere. I'm just arguing that our approach to threats and the social results that we're seeing in society right now, we're clearly suffering from a certain amount of perceptual distortion. We're having a hard time managing the sorts of things that we are right now in the kind of environment we've been put into. There's a mismatch between the creature and environment. It's like you put a lion into the penguin exhibit, or you put a penguin into the naked mole rat exhibit. You're going to see some weird behaviors going on because there's a serious mismatch between environment and the creature that you put into it. And so I think you can see that, including in a lot of the tribalism that you see online, our increasingly tribal approach to evils. It's also complemented by an increasingly tribal approach to goods. We assess long view goods with very shallow consideration. We fail to criticize and judge with a clearer, more personal eye. And what I mean by that is we look at things and we think, would this be useful? Would this be a good thing to have? Well, and we evaluate it, my tribe is under attack. Well, on a long view basis, that would be a good idea. I'm engaged in a war, so let's use that tool, Whereas some of these things, and even some of these people that we're willing to work with, if you were taking a more personal eye to it, you'd say, oh, I don't want that in my life. I wouldn't trust that person in person. I wouldn't think that would be a good idea in my own life to act that way, to talk to people that way, to take that kind of approach. But because I see myself as being in this kind of situation, I think it is a good idea. So that's another example. We ignore things that we should notice because they fall outside the long view narrative window. This big narrative. Here's what we're doing. We selectively pick out a narrow range of features from a far vaster sea of details because they fit our shallow focus. This will be useful for this. So it's okay if it has all these problems. I can just ignore that. We let our positive value systems be subverted and distorted by these same myopic landscapes and telescopic portraits that were distorting our negative value system. Now, if I would say, for example, and some people might not agree with this, I don't think Trump was particularly good for the Republican Party. I understand why a lot of people like Trump. I feel like I understand it more than I ever did before now, and I am enormously sympathetic towards Trump supporters. But I am not very sympathetic towards Trump himself because I don't think he really lived up to and was worthy of the burdens that were placed on him, the things that were asked for him. I feel like he took advantage of what people were investing in him and what people wanted him to be and what people wanted him to mean, what they needed him to be. They wanted him to be a certain good. They needed him to be a certain good. I think he really took advantage of that in his own personal way and in ways that really mostly just helped him and actually didn't help the very people who were looking to him for help. And I think that is one thing where this distortion of perspective, because he was very much an online phenomenon, it became a reasonable thing to do. I think in part just because of the fact that it was this media experience. It wasn't like real life experience. I mean, the real life experience of Trump for a lot of people seems to be pretty bad. But his media experience is very stimulating. And so much of politics now has just become what kind of media experience can you provide? But I do think that is one way to look at things is we're making myopic landscapes and telescopic portraits. And if you think those two concepts through, those don't really work. And they're going to mess up how you see bad things. And they're going to mess up how you see good things. They're going to mess up whether you see a danger as a danger. Maybe you won't. Or maybe you'll see something that's a small, distant danger, and you'll see it as this massive, pervasive danger. Same thing with the good, something that might, well, maybe it's kind of good, but in other ways it's not. But you only see this bit of it. You only see this very shallow slice of it, or maybe this very narrow, detailed view of things, because you're not actually able to bring to bear those normal perceptual systems that would help you sort of maintain your sanity and see the world clearly. Now, this is probably the point where I really should admit I have a serious perspective problem myself. My problem is that I do try to just do it all. You know, I see all of the near points as lines extending off into the far distance, and I want to follow every personal detail to its farthest abstractions, you know, of embodiment. And what that means is that I tend to easily get very lost in the abstract and in the interconnectedness of everything, of all ideas, and I completely lose sight of the really meaty personal details that actually connect to people in their actual lives. When I first started thinking along these lines, thinking about this subject, it was years ago. It was just this tiny little mundane thought where I was just like, I think something about the way that we're experiencing the reporting on coronavirus, like I said, these like daily football report style bits of information, I was like, I think that's having some sort of bad effect on us, on our outlook. I feel like if you took anything in the world and started reporting on it like that, where every single day you report every single instance across the entirety of the nation, and you threw it up against people, that would start freaking them the freak out. And I think that is very much the case, and that's happened to people about a whole bunch of different things on both sides of the political spectrum. I think everybody is subject to this. Now, I had that little, very basic day-to-day sort of thought of, I can tell that just seeing that chart every single day in the newspaper is kind of stressing my wife out in a way that is disconnected from her actual day-to-day experience of coronavirus, and also messes up the way she evaluates the things that she is doing to mitigate her danger, which were all really good. It's not like we weren't doing things to mitigate our risk, but my point is seeing those things reported like that gives you the sense that the things you were doing aren't doing anything because you're getting reporting that is disconnected from your own immediate experience. Like the two aren't connected. So as I said, I had that sort of personal insight, and it made me sort of realize, there's this weird structural peculiarity to modern life that seems to be caused by modern media and technology. It's causing this very odd mismatch between our actual world and our perceptual world. Now, in order to explain and think through an idea like that, someone like me feels like they have to explain everything in the world to try and talk about that. In order to make my point about that, I feel like I have to establish all the background arguments, all of the knowledge that supports and defines my point and that derives from it. I just can't stop things expanding. Maybe that's just because I studied philosophy. So maybe that's part of that philosophical training, to just dig way too deep into everything and to cross-connect everything to everything and feel like you have to justify and provide the background arguments for everything. Or maybe that's just the sort of person I am. I mean, clearly I'm someone who can't just very easily say the simple thing that he has to say up front, which is a fairly mundane observation, which is, I think, the way that we talk about things or learn about things is messing up our brains. And it's not like there was any shortage of tangible details, at the time. At the time, back when things first started getting, crazy during coronavirus, it was obvious a lot of people were being freaked out by those same things. There was lots of crazy feelings. There was lots of crazy behaviors and actions. And the question is, well, was it because coronavirus was so crazy, or was it because the way we were processing the idea of it was so crazy because I mean, I feel like things were relatively reasonable here, but we still had hoarding, we had anxiety. People were afraid to just walk on the same side of the street as people. They were afraid to talk to people. People were afraid of going outside. People had these immense feelings of stress and helplessness. Like, those are some pretty crazy emotional effects. Whereas, as I said, you would think that we're in the grip of this nightmare apocalypse. But the truth is, at least here, almost all of that was just in our heads. It was something we created among ourselves. It was not like the actual lived experience. I don't know, for so long, I did not know a single person. Like, for the first 2 years, I didn't know a single person who had had COVID, much less anyone who was struggling to overcome it. Eventually, I did. Various people in my family did eventually get it. And we're just like, oh, yeah, I wouldn't have even noticed that I'd had it if it hadn't been for, the fact that I was keeping such a tight watch on my health. I did have one unvaccinated relative of my wife's who did have a harder time with it. But even the older grandparents who got it in my family, they did great. It's not that it wasn't a thing. It's just that there was a mismatch between the dealing of it and people's thinking about it. Even in the city that I live in, I remember when things were at the height of total paranoia, it's a city of 500,000 people, and the amount of people who actually had coronavirus, you could have fit into like a single decent sized room, the amount of people who were dying from it or seriously ill was not a humongous amount of people, especially in the perspective of the amount of people that are just dying and seriously ill in the course of life. Of course, we often don't have to see that. But the the mental experience that people were having was so much bigger, and I'm not in any way belittling the value of the people who did get sick or did have a tough time, or even those people who did die. I'm just saying there was this big disconnect between our apparent perception of how pervasive the experience of threat was and the actual experience of the threat. And I think that's part of what caused a lot of the craziness, and also the counter reactions too. The counter reactions that people had, people who pushed back against it, and sometimes in their own crazy ways of pushing back hard against it, is because we were experiencing this weight of this pervasive intellectual experience of the threat, but we couldn't connect it to real things in our actual lives. And we're running around with these very actionable fear responses, or being told that we're supposed to have these actual fear responses in us, but we don't have anything to actually connect them to that's in front of us that we can grab hold of, that we can do, that matches the idea and the reality together. And that just makes us all go kind of cray-cray. So people had to find some way to express it. People had to find a way to deal with it, to confront the threats that our information was telling us were all around us, crouching right at your door. And if we couldn't find a useful, focused, practical, immediate outlet, we just found whatever outlet we could. And it's interesting because, Canada, that was their whole approach to governance. They didn't look at the proximate. They didn't look at the realities. They did things based on opinion polls. They said, well, how do people feel about coronavirus? Do you feel like doing this is a good idea? And people would say, yes, yeah, you're telling us to be freaked out, that we should be terrified, and I would feel better if someone were doing something to address that, because that is how humans feel. If you make someone afraid, they instinctively want you to have an actionable element to it. They either want to do something about it themselves, or they want you to do something about it. So then if you say, do you want us to do something about it? People, of course, will say yes. And they said, all right, so let's do some things. And of course, they did things that were not necessarily even useful, and you see crazy things in China of them corona testing fish and like spraying spraying sanitizer on like airplane runways. I mean, people did some really crazy things during it, and it's just because of all this stress and tension built up and the need to act on fear, this deep need to act, and or if you can't, to do something with it. And maybe that's to completely reject it, completely reject the fear, completely push it all away and just say, I don't know what to do with this. This is making unreasonable demands on me. This is distorting my brain. I can't connect it to my immediate life. So I'm just going to junk that whole narrative. And that's another thing that people did, you know. We artificially, we had to devise things to do with our fear. You know, we didn't really have, as just individual humans, that many really useful practical things we could do. And even when we did them, it didn't affect the amount of fear warnings that were still being dropped on us. There wasn't this normal dialogue between knowledge, action, response. Instead, we just got even more of it. So since we couldn't figure that out, didn't know what to do with it, and so we couldn't find a practical or useful or immediate outlet, like I said, we just found whatever outlets we could. You know, we started calling 911 to report that our neighbors were playing in their yards. We start buying up stacks of toilet paper that we don't really need to prepare for a supply shortage that we created by doing that. You know, we stressed out and we snapped at each other. We criticized each other. We rebelled against each other for very, very tiny little things. You know, we started criticizing every little step, every word, every press release, every social media post. You know, our actionable fear responses were just stoked up to the high heavens, and we needed to do something to work them out and feel like there was some sort of response to it. You know, and you have to ask how much of the total vitriol that we experience on social media, just in general, I'm not talking about coronavirus, and just in general, how much of everything that is on social media is really just that same phenomenon going on with just different existential threats. And none of that means that those threats, whatever they are, aren't real, but maybe there is some misalignment between our perceptions, our experience, and our course of action. And maybe technology is making it worse. So I think I've made my case fairly well here, or poorly, but you know, you can take it as you will. So basically that's all I have to say, but for those of you who want to hang on, I do have some PSs. They're more tangential. They're more just things that have come up to my mind thinking about this kind of subject. So if you want to stick with it, you can keep listening, but if all you want to do is follow that discussion to the end, it's essentially over. So here's the first thing that I was thinking about. You know, I think it's worth emphasizing that everything is a matter of degree. You know, most things aren't just right or just wrong. It's about context. It's about how far do you take it, or how not far enough do you take it, you know. Just a personal example that comes to mind. I grew up in a small town that had more limited options of all kinds. It was a small town out in the country. And so I loved the connections that I found to other people, other minds, through books, through readings. And I remember telling my sister that Dorothy L. Sayers seemed like as good a friend to me through her writing as any of my friends in real life. And she told me that sounded pathetic. Now that's a funny interaction to reflect on, and I really do, in a way, understand what she meant. My sister was a very friendly and sociable and popular person. She still is. And me, I was kind of an odd person. I was bullied a lot. I often had a hard time fitting in. It's not that I didn't feel like I had friends. I did have good friends, but I found a lot of value in these thought peers that were hard to find in my real life. So I can really understand why people today, want to use technology in the way that they use it. I understand the value and the attraction to use technology to allow us to connect to our thought peers, those people who are of like mind to ourselves. It is a really nice thing to do. The problem is, as I said, a matter of degree. Alienation occurs when we go too far. You're still supposed to, it's not like I wasn't still in the world that I was in. I still spent lots of time in my proximate world talking and spending time with and doing things with all these people in my immediate environment. That as much time as I spent there, as much as I lived there, I was still in the world, and that anchored me and that grounded me. And I really long-term think it was very good for me. It's very tempting to just silo ourselves and surround ourselves in our thought bubbles to the detriment of the much larger practical and experiential world that we live in. You want to take something that's really just a little bit you and make it into everything. And technology really helps you do that. It kind of helps you make a sort of monk into yourself. Now, most of us aren't real monks, living in isolation on mountaintops with no options to connect except through social media or the internet. Most of us live in a country, in a city, in a neighborhood, in a family, with a lot of people very close by to us who share our space, who connect to our lives, and whose ability to connect to us, whose visibility and investment and influence can really suffer if we overly mentally dislocate ourselves to more rarefied thought communities. And I think they lose something by losing you, and you lose something by losing them. So this is what I'm saying. It's a matter of balance. It's a matter of how far do you take it. Do you say I'm not interested at all in connecting to those more rarefied thought worlds? I'm just gonna be in my immediate thing. It's nice to connect to that, but not at the expense of isolating yourself from your actual world. It's wonderful to be able to taste rarities that have been gathered for our gastronomic pleasure from the far corners of the earth. I'm thinking about food here. But if you make that the basis of your diet, the foundation of what you live on, instead of actually living off what actually grows in the land that we live in, that is going to cause some long-term problems, complications, and distortions for us, for the environment, for the global economy, the supply chain, for the people we source those delicacies from, for the producers who actually live near to us. I'm not saying that it can't be done, or that it shouldn't be done. Clearly, especially in the world we're living in now, that technology has made, where people have really chased those desires for rarefied delights deeply, can't is just water under the bridge. It's already been done. And so it's out there, but we still have to face the question of should. And that's still a question we can answer for ourselves. We don't have to embrace something just because it's there, just because it's offered to us, just because it's tempting of us, just because I could live off of nothing but imported buffalo cheeses every single day of my life. Doesn't mean I can't ask, well, should I? Should I actually do that? And often that's a question of, it's a question of degree. Maybe it's a nice treat to have sometimes. But maybe it should not be your staple diet. Maybe that is not sustainable. Maybe it's a lovely thing to be able to enjoy these distant things and these special rarefied things to a certain degree. But there's a point in the progression where it becomes a bigger and bigger part of your life, where it actually is becoming structurally problematic, both for you and maybe for the entire world. The world and ourselves weren't really meant to work that way. It creates vulnerabilities. It creates distortions. It creates weak points. It creates an unrealistic picture of what the world around us is. And it's not clear that everyone getting exactly what they want all the time, perfectly tailored for them, is actually as utopian idea as that sounds like at first blush. It's not actually clear that our minds are even meant to work that way, that we're actually made to experience something like that, that is not an experience that wouldn't completely hijack and overwhelm us. There is such a thing as too much of a good thing, Vitamins are good for you, and they are important. But they seem very much to be of the most benefit when you get them naturally through your food, rather than through artificial supplementation, completely blowing out the quantities of them in the craziest ways. And what's more, it's also very easy to get way too much when you're taking supplements, which I know it's hard for people to believe that, but actually too much of vitamins is just as bad as not enough of them, and it's actively bad for you, It's funny because when you do take too many supplements, it looks like they actually harm your health outcomes rather than helping them. But of course, people go for it because that's not how we instinctively think about things. We just instinctively think, good thing, good, more of good thing, more good, without really stopping at any point to question whether that's actually true, or whether we are in any way designed for that, or whether that's blowing out some of our perceptual judgments in ways that we can't perceive. We're all a bit more like dogs or children than we would like to admit. This thing is good, so more of that good thing, maybe even nothing but that, must be even better. Now obesity, when it comes to something like food, that's one really clear, ubiquitous, major problem that disproves that theory. But this principle is true even on a microscopic level. Toxicity, as any good scientist could tell you, isn't about identity. It's about dosage. It's not about the thing. It's about how much of it do you have? Too little? Too much? What is the right amount? Do you have the proper amount of it? You need salt and you need water. You need 1,000 different things to live. Some in large amounts, some in very small amounts. And virtually all of them, even the most obviously healthy and desirable, are toxic if you take them in sufficiently large dosages. So many of the things that make life work are like that. In low doses, even poisons can be harmless. And at the right dose, most things can be beneficial, if it's the right dose for that thing. And in high doses, even the very best things will kill you. Now, modern media is basically the vitamin supplement version of human interaction. It gives you these concentrated, simplified doses of the things you want without having to wade through all that extra stuff and track down those hard-to-find nutrients you need. But actually trying to live off of supplements, trying to live off of a diet that gets the majority of its content from supplements, it's a distortion of how humans were meant to feed themselves. It's like this. There, in the 1950s, there was this sort of idea that someday we'll be getting all of our nutritional needs in a single pill. It was a nice idea, in a way. For starving people, it might be a very useful temporary remedy. But in the long term, for normal, healthy people, it is not how humans were meant to survive. And trying to live off of a chemical diet is going to have all kinds of unanticipated complications. And for those people who have tried to live like that, it does, My dad's a doctor, and one of his patients almost died from a vitamin overdose. She was taking huge amounts of supplements, most of which her body could get rid of. I mean, that's a great thing about at least a lot of vitamins, is once you have enough of them, your body will just excrete them. But some of them are not so easy to get rid of, and those built up in her system and built up in her system and built up until they reached a toxic level and her organs began shutting down. She just assumed more of a good thing couldn't hurt her, and it must only be better. Or at least it's just neutral. How could more of a good thing be bad for you? Her blood actually had to be cleared of those toxins by a machine. And those toxins were the very things that she thought were good for her and that her health consisted in. If she had been forced to eat like a normal person and get her nutrition through more natural means by eating actual whole foods, she never could have achieved the kinds of overdoses that she did. She never could have eaten enough in the natural way to reach those dosages. Her own body would have stopped her and said, that's it, no more, But the structure of her approach, taking this distillation, supplementation, selecting only those things that are the things that I really want and that I think are what matter, that removed all the safeguards. That's what took away all the things protecting her from the potential dangers of the things that were good and that she actually did need. So on a final note, I've spent a certain amount of time reviewing lots of different scientific literature about personalities and development and childhood and long-term life outcomes. And there is an enormous amount of uncertainty and complication about what makes us who we are today and tomorrow. There isn't a simple story of us. There are a lot of different factors operating parallel. Who we are and who we become is partly limited and structured by our inherited nature, who we are born to be. And then it's influenced and altered again, and it's confirmed by or directed by our family and our circumstances and our culture and our personal choices and history and just chance, things that happen to us. And one of the biggest, most powerful influences on us, one of several, but one that you really shouldn't underestimate, is our peer group. Children and also adults. Don't think it's just children, it's also adults. We're enormously influenced and affected in who we become by our social peers. We are social animals. We understand and experience and define ourselves in a very social context. It's a huge part of what makes us who we are and who we end up becoming from what we begin with. So, what happens when you radically change the rules for human social experience? When, in the course of a few years, you radically alter or remove the barriers to certain kinds of communication or data gathering or response, and when other traditional channels of communication and experience are largely cut off in favor of just a few. What happens when you do to the human social life what this distillary, supplementary approach to nutrition was trying to do? What forces and experiences are you empowering, and what are you neglecting? What are you allowing to atrophy? What are the practical results going to be of such a radical retooling of one of the primary influences on human nature? What are the dangers of it? Considering that all humans are finite in their capacities and that, our faculties themselves, our minds themselves, they haven't been greatly altered or expanded. We are still very much the same creatures we were 3,000 years ago. The only thing that has changed is how we're using them and the purview for their use. That has been altered enormously through technology. It's been altered, it's been expanded, that's been changed. The way that information is selected, the way that it's conveyed to us, that's been changed a lot. So, we can more freely choose what we want to attend to. We aren't really seeing, we aren't truly seeing or knowing anything more than we ever could before. We just have more freedom to set our sights and our lenses more easily at greater extremes of vision. So what I mean is, you're not any smarter and you aren't really seeing any more than anyone else who ever lived, because that's limited by the human person. Your ability to choose what you're paying attention to, how you're using your lenses, that's what's changed. You actually haven't. So to use the sort of camera analogy here, your focus has changed. You got a whole new set of lenses. You've got lenses that let you look really far or really wide. But the actual size of your viewfinder has not changed at all. Viewfinder is the human mind that can take it in. That thing is the same. So even if you've managed to change your lenses a lot, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can actually hold more or take in more. You can just more easily pick which things. Less of that is determined by the world immediately around you. And that raises a question. If that is happening, if all of a sudden I can spend far more time hearing about and thinking about what's happening in California or New York instead of what's happening in my own life, in my own town, in my own children's school, in my own church, in my own family, etc., am I really seeing more? Am I really knowing more? Am I really part of this larger place and community that I think I am? Or have I just taken the attention that I had for the world that I was part of and the narrative that I saw myself as being embedded in, and just redirected it to other things further away? And that raises some extra questions. So if we are doing that, if all you're really doing is not actually seeing more, but just being able to technologically exercise more freedom to only look at what you're interested in, what are you neglecting? What are you missing? How is it going to affect your navigation in the world that you're actually standing in with your own 2 feet? How is it going to affect the way that you walk through that world? How is it going to affect those systems of development and response, of knowledge and wisdom and action, and the way that all of them are integrated and find resolution, so that you don't just have anxiety continuously that never results in any sort of, productive action or development or learning? How much might we be carelessly walking around our near neighbors and just not seeing any of the things around us because we're walking around with binoculars? I mean, the binoculars are impressive, but if you see someone walking around your neighborhood with the binoculars continuously strapped to their face, you can guarantee they're missing some things. They're seeing some stuff far away, but they're actually going to have a hard time walking around their neighborhood, and they're going to miss the majority of it. I'm not saying that binoculars aren't very useful, or that certain people and certain jobs might be well suited for keeping watch with them. Some people do need to keep a watch on the far horizons. And taking a glance through the binoculars can help you plan the steps on your journey, especially if where you're going is far. But should you make seeing the world through binoculars the majority of your vision, the majority of the way that you see the world, the majority of the way that you navigate the world? That is a question that we need to ask ourselves. Now, this is just an analogy. It's one that doesn't exactly map perfectly onto what I'm trying to talk about. It's not one that I would follow too slavishly, but it's something that I do think we should think about. I do feel like the internet it's not really expanding your viewfinder. It's not really letting you be able to see more, in the sense that there is only so much that your eyes and your mind can genuinely take in. It's just changing your lenses. You're either seeing something wide and shallow, or you're seeing small and deep, far away, carefully selected, Is this how you want to be? Do you want to be walking around all the time looking through binoculars? And how foolish do you look doing that kind of thing? What do people who are actually walking around without them think about you, you know? And are they looking and say, oh, watch out for that person, because they do not have their eyes on the immediate surroundings. They're walking around going, oh my gosh, look at that storm 50 miles away over there. Oh my gosh, look at that bird 600 yards away. And you're saying you're about to fall down an open manhole. Anyway, that's all for today. We'll see you next time.